The execution feed crackled across the void, transmitted on thousands of imperial frequencies, projected onto towering screens across major planets and outpost stations. The image was unmistakable: a human woman, bound at the wrists, her red dress torn and dirted, strands of golden hair falling over bruised cheeks. Her chin was raised, eyes unwavering, the defiance of a doomed soul refusing to kneel. Eleanor Shaw had been a diplomat, a voice of reason in an empire that thrived on subjugation. They had accused her of sedition, of conspiring to incite rebellion among the human colonies. The trial had been nothing more than a spectacle, her fate sealed before the first gavel struck. And now, beneath the flickering banners of the Galactic Empire, she stood on the execution platform, the noose tightening around her throat. A cold silence filled the air as the High Executor stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost serene. Let this be a lesson to all who defy the will of the Empire. Humanity must understand its place. Eleanor did not beg, did not cry. Her lips moved, forming words the executioner would never hear, a message carried only by the wind. Somewhere across the vast reaches of space, a man watched. The bar was quiet, save for the occasional clink of glass and low murmurs of conversation. The patrons were varied: a handful of traders nursing drinks, a group of off-duty mercenaries exchanging tall tales, and a lone man in the farthest booth, half-shadowed beneath the dim glow of the overhead light. Baba Yaga sat still, eyes locked onto the transmission playing from a hollow projector on the wall. His fingers curled around the glass in front of him, though he had long forgotten the taste of the whiskey burning down his throat. His jaw was set, expression unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders told a story only a few in the galaxy would recognize. He had left this life behind. He had walked away, believing, hoping, that peace was something he could grasp. Eleanor had given him that hope. The trapdoor released. The rope snapped tight. The hollow feed cut out. Baba closed his eyes, inhaled once, then stood. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had no reason left to hesitate. As he stepped away from the table, a bartender who had been watching from afar flinched at the quiet scrape of the chair legs against the floor. The weight in the air had changed. It was not grief nor fury. It was something colder, sharper, the finality of a storm that had been waiting to break. He left the bar without a word, vanishing into the neon-lit corridors of the spaceport. The Empire did not know what it had done. The first sign of retribution came 3 nights later. An Imperial outpost on the fringe of the Zereth system ceased all communications. When a patrol ship was sent to investigate, they found the compound eerily silent, the lights flickering sporadically. The security feed, still active, showed bodies. Dozens of them. Some had died without a sound, their throats slit. Others had managed to fire their weapons, but had barely managed a shot before falling. There were no survivors. And then they saw it. One of the officers, a junior lieutenant, pointed a shaking hand at the bloodied wall in the command center. The words scrawled across the metal in crimson were simple, yet they sent ice through every soldier who laid eyes upon them. "You took something from me. I'll take everything from you." The news traveled swiftly. At first, there was confusion. A rogue attack? An insurgent raid? But when the analysis came in, when they saw the efficiency, the calculated method in which every man had been killed, it became clear this was no ordinary act of vengeance. This was the work of one man, Baba Yaga. Governor Xyloth dismissed it at first. "A myth," he sneered, sipping from an ornate goblet as he reclined in his seat. "A human assassin with a grudge? Let him come. He is one man. We are an empire." Admiral Varian, however, knew better. He had fought in the suppression of humanity's resistance years ago, had seen firsthand what a single, well-trained killer could do. And if the whispers were to be believed, if this was truly the same man who had once torn through the criminal underworld of Earth and beyond, then they had not just made an enemy. They had called forth something worse. The next attack came swifter, bolder. An Imperial convoy, carrying high-value officers from the capital, was ambushed mid-transit. The ships had been secured with the highest level of protection, an escort fleet ensuring no outsider could possibly breach their defenses. Yet, when the wreckage was discovered, it was clear the defenses had been meaningless. The officers had been found dead, each with a single shot placed precisely between their eyes. Their guards had fared no better. Every single one of them had been eliminated. And just like before, there were no survivors. Admiral Varian watched the footage in grim silence, his hands tightening into fists. There was something terrifying about it, something unnatural. This was not an act of war. War had strategy, had diplomacy, had the possibility of surrender. This was something else entirely. It was retribution. By now, rumors had begun to spread. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, their hands twitching over their weapons, their eyes scanning every shadow. The name was whispered, as though speaking it aloud would summon the man himself. Baba Yaga, a name that carried the weight of a ghost story, the kind of tale told in the trenches to remind soldiers that there were worse things than war. The Empire had taken his wife. They had displayed her death for the galaxy to see, believing it would break the human spirit. Instead, they had woken something they could not comprehend. Baba Yaga was coming, and he would not stop. The weight of silence in the Imperial command chamber was suffocating. The officers gathered around the holographic display, their uniforms crisp, their faces drawn tight with barely concealed apprehension. The images flickering before them told a story too grim to ignore. Bodies laid out in precise execution patterns, ships reduced to twisted wreckage, entire squads gone without raising an alarm. Admiral Varian exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against the cool metal of the command table. He had spent decades in war, had crushed rebellions, had fought against the fiercest warriors the galaxy had to offer. But what he saw now was not war. This was something darker, something meticulous, something personal. The assassin had an aim. The whispers had reached him from the lower ranks, spoken with the same fear one might reserve for a curse. Baba Yaga. Varian clenched his jaw. Legends and ghost stories had no place in the imperial hierarchy, but the undeniable truth stood before him. One man had dismantled their security forces with an efficiency that defied explanation. And this was only the beginning. Across the chamber, Governor Xyloth sat with a smirk curling the edges of his thin lips, his fingers tapping idly against the golden trim of his robe. Unlike Varian, he found the entire matter amusing. A lone human, he mused, shaking his head. You're telling me one man is causing all this trouble? Please, Admiral. We command entire fleets. Send a battalion. This will be over before the next cycle. Varian did not look at him. He knew the type. Politicians who believed power was measured in fleets and banners, who thought control meant safety. They had never seen what one man could do when stripped of everything, when vengeance was the only force keeping them alive. A battalion won't be enough, Varian said finally. He's not fighting a war. He's delivering a message. Xyloth scoffed, taking a slow sip from his goblet. Then send the Praetorian hunters. A ripple of unease passed through the officers. The Praetorian hunters were the Empire's elite, a force composed of cybernetically enhanced warriors, bred for the sole purpose of eradicating threats. To send them after one man was an admission that this was more than a minor rebellion. Varian gave a single nod. I'll lead them myself. The first strike came swiftly. Yaga knew they would come. There was no way the Empire would allow their humiliation to continue unanswered. He had tracked their movements, listening to intercepted transmissions, piecing together patterns. The Empire was predictable in its arrogance. A fleet of ships touched down on the barren world of Myros 7, a forgotten planet on the fringes of Imperial space. Varian and his hunters moved with military precision, their dark armor gleaming under the planet's twin suns. They expected an ambush, but the wastelands remained eerily still. No gunfire, no resistance. Varian narrowed his eyes. He had studied the assassin's tactics, had dissected the way he dismantled the outposts. Yaga never struck without reason, which meant this silence was deliberate. The first explosion ripped through the northern ridge, a controlled detonation that sent a cascade of rock and metal hurtling toward the advancing Imperial force. The hunters barely had time to react before the second explosion tore through their left flank, sending soldiers sprawling, their armor shredded by the concussive force. Then the killing began. Baba Yaga moved like a phantom through the chaos, striking with a precision that bordered on mechanical. He did not waste bullets. Every shot found a target, an exposed throat, a crack in armor, a visor turned the wrong way. The Praetorian hunters were fast, but Yaga was faster. They were strong, but he was ruthless. A hunter lunged, blade flashing, but Yaga caught the strike midair, twisting the soldier's wrist until bones cracked. The man barely had time to scream before Yaga buried the blade into the exposed joint beneath his ribs, letting the body drop without a second glance. Varian saw it unfold with the cold detachment of a strategist. His men were dying. Fast. Fall back, he ordered, his voice clipped. But it was too late. Yaga had set the battlefield against them before they had even arrived. Their retreat led them straight into a kill zone. Automatic turrets, triggered by movement sensors, began to fire from hidden outposts. The hunters, trained to fight in direct combat, were not prepared for the relentless efficiency of one man who had turned the very terrain into a weapon. Bodies fell. The Praetorian elite, feared across the galaxy, were being hunted. Varian moved quickly, sidestepping a hail of gunfire, his mind racing through every tactical possibility. Yaga was relentless, but he was still human. He could be outmaneuvered. Then he saw the flicker of movement in his periphery. Yaga was there, just there, shifting through the battlefield like a shadow, pistol raised. Varian barely ducked in time as the shot cracked past his helmet, burning a hot line across his cheek. He rolled, drawing his own weapon, but by the time he aimed, Yaga was gone. The Admiral swore under his breath. He had underestimated this man. A warning blared through his comms. Emergency evacuation protocols activated. The remaining hunters, those few who had survived, were retreating toward the extraction point. Varian turned, his jaw tight with frustration. They were running. He was running. Baba Yaga had won this battle. As the Imperial dropships lifted off, leaving the carnage below, Varian stared out the viewport, his expression unreadable. Baba Yaga was not just an assassin. He was an executioner. The fleet arrived back at the capital with far fewer soldiers than it had departed with. The defeat sent ripples through the empire, an unspoken fear creeping into even the highest ranks. If one man could do this, what else was he capable of? Governor Zyloth watched the report with disinterest, swirling his wine as he leaned back in his chair. "So we lost a few soldiers," he said with a shrug. "Replace them. Double the security on my palace. He won't dare strike here." Varian said nothing. He simply turned, leaving the chamber without another word. In the cold void of space, aboard an unmarked vessel, Baba Yaga sat alone, reloading his weapons with methodical precision. His expression did not waver. His hands did not shake. He had made his first strike. The Empire had drawn first blood. Now it was his turn. The Imperial Senate was in chaos. Voices overlapped in angry shouts, fists slammed against polished tables, and the air trembled with barely contained fear. Never before had the Empire been humiliated like this. A single man had shattered their illusion of invincibility, torn through their forces like a wraith from humanity's darkest legends. Governor Zyloth sat at the head of the chamber, fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne-like seat. His expression was impassive, but his eyes flickered with irritation as the senators bickered before him. The weight of their failures was beginning to settle, and though he loathed to admit it, he knew the reality they all feared. Baba Yaga had become a force they could no longer dismiss. Admiral Varian stood in the center of the room, silent. He had already given his report. Yaga had dismantled the Praetorian hunters, evaded their best tracking systems, and left the Imperial elite scrambling. The whispers of rebellion had already begun spreading across human-controlled territories. Yaga wasn't just an assassin anymore. He was a symbol. Zyloth finally raised a hand, and silence fell. His voice was smooth, almost lazy. "Tell me, Admiral, what exactly do you propose? Since our so-called best have proven ineffective." Varian did not react to the insult. "We escalate," he said, his voice steady. "We bring the full weight of the Empire down on him. We stop treating this as an isolated threat and make an example of humanity itself." A murmur swept through the chamber. This was the line they had danced around, the decision that would turn whispers of war into something real. Xylotha's smirk widened. "You propose genocide." Varian's gaze was cold. "I propose inevitability." The order was given within the hour. Across the galaxy, human colonies came under siege. Cities were burned, entire settlements erased in the span of days. The Empire's message was clear. For every Imperial life taken, thousands of human lives would be snuffed out in return. They would not just break Baba Yaga. They would make him watch as his people were turned to ash. The news reached him in fragments, urgent transmissions intercepted from hidden channels, desperate cries from those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Yaga did not react, not at first. He listened, his jaw set, his fingers tightening around the grip of his pistol. He had known the Empire would retaliate, but this was more than punishment. This was extermination. And yet, for the first time, he hesitated. The names of the dead were countless. The cities lost were beyond saving. He had started this war, but had he truly understood the cost? His injuries still ached from his last battle, the deep gash along his ribs burning each time he moved. He was tired. He had fought alone for so long, but now he needed an army. There were whispers in the underworld, rumors of factions that had long hated the Empire but lacked a reason to rise. Mercenaries, warlords, smugglers, those who thrived in the lawless void between controlled space. They would not fight for justice. They would not fight for vengeance. But they would fight for a price. Yaga disappeared into the darkest corners of the galaxy, moving from shadow to shadow, finding the leaders of these factions in hidden enclaves and crime-ridden worlds. He made them an offer: join him, and they would have free reign over the spoils of war. The Empire had riches beyond counting, vaults of treasure guarded by fleets. It was not morality that moved them. It was opportunity. One by one, they pledged their weapons to his cause. The first real battle came swiftly. The Empire, emboldened by their terror campaign, had become reckless, spreading their forces thin in an effort to crush humanity's resistance before it could take root. A fleet of warships stationed over the colony world of Bastion, for was the first target. Yaga led the assault himself. The night sky over Bastion, for burned with streaks of fire as ships clashed in a brutal engagement. The mercenary fleet, hardened by years of piracy and survival, fought with a savagery that Imperial commanders had not anticipated. Yaga moved through the battlefield with an eerie precision, slipping past enemy lines, disabling key command centers with ruthless efficiency. By dawn, the Imperial blockade had been shattered. Bastion had been freed. The message was clear. Humanity would not go quietly. But victories had their cost. The Empire responded with even greater force, sending entire legions to crush the rebellion before it could gain traction. The mercenaries, once eager for war, began to waver. The Empire was vast, its resources endless. Even with Yaga's tactical brilliance, could they truly win? Doubt crept in. Betrayals followed. The attack on Draco's Prime was meant to be a turning point, a decisive strike that would shake the core of the Empire. But something had gone wrong. The enemy had been waiting. Yaga's forces were ambushed, his ships targeted before they could even reach orbit. The battle turned into a massacre. Yaga fought as he always did, but even he could not stop what was coming. One moment, he was cutting through soldiers in the wreckage of a downed transport, his knife finding soft flesh between armor plates. The next, there was fire, an explosion too close, heat searing across his back as he was thrown through the air. Pain. His vision blurred. His body refused to move. He heard the crackling of flames, the distant echoes of screaming men, and then the boot of an Imperial officer pressing against his chest. Admiral Varian loomed over him, expression unreadable. His uniform was pristine, unmarred by battle, his movements precise as he crouched down, studying the man who had brought the empire to its knees. "You've caused quite the mess," Varian murmured, almost amused. "Did you really think you could win this war alone?" Yaga did not answer. His breathing was ragged, his fingers twitching toward the knife still strapped to his thigh. Varian caught the movement, sighing as he pressed harder with his boot, forcing Yaga's body against the rubble. "You never stop, do you?" He reached into his belt, pulling out a small holographic device. With a flick of his fingers, the image of Governor Xyloth appeared. The governor's smug expression stretched into a grin as he took in the scene. "Ah," Xyloth mused, tilting his head. "So this is the infamous Baba Yaga. Not so unstoppable now, are you?" Varian remained silent. Xyloth chuckled. "We could kill you here, you know. But that would be far too simple. You've made yourself into a myth, Yaga. And myths need to be broken." Varian finally spoke. "We're taking him to Zareth." Yaga did not react, but inside he understood. Zareth, the imperial capital. The place where Eleanor had been executed. They weren't going to kill him. They were going to make an example of him. Pain pulsed through his body, but he forced his expression to remain neutral, eyes locking onto Varian's. The admiral held his gaze for a long moment before giving a single nod. "Take him." The last thing Yaga saw before the darkness swallowed him was the burning remains of his rebellion. The chains were cold against his wrists, their weight biting into his skin as he was dragged through the towering halls of the imperial palace. The scent of polished steel and incense filled the air, a mockery of the blood and smoke that had brought him here. Guards flanked him on either side, their rifles held tight, their movements stiff. They feared him, even now, even bound and battered. Baba Yaga kept his head low, his steps measured. His body screamed in protest, every muscle torn, every wound a reminder of the battle he had lost. His ribs were bruised, his vision blurred at the edges, but none of it mattered. His mind was clear. His purpose remained. At the end of a long corridor, the great doors of the imperial throne room loomed. They parted with a hiss, revealing a vast chamber bathed in golden light, its high ceilings adorned with banners of conquest. At the center, reclined in his opulent throne, was Governor Xyloth. A smirk played on the governor's lips as he took in the sight before him. "Ah, Yaga," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "The mighty assassin, at last reduced to a prisoner. I must admit, I expected more of a struggle." Baba said nothing. His gaze flickered past the governor, scanning the room. Dozens of guards lined the chamber, their weapons poised. High-ranking officials stood along the walls, watching with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. And then there was Admiral Varian, standing near the throne, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not smirk. He did not gloat. He simply observed, his expression unreadable. Xyloth rose from his seat, stepping forward with deliberate ease. "You've caused quite the mess," he mused, circling Baba like a predator playing with its prey. "You killed my officers. You burned my ships. You made the empire bleed." His smirk widened. "And for what? Some misguided vengeance? A war you had no hope of winning." Baba exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into fists. His pulse remained steady, his breathing even. Xyloth leaned in slightly. "Tell me, Yaga, was she worth it?" A slow silence filled the chamber. And then Yaga moved. The guards never saw it coming. One moment he was standing still, shackled and beaten. The next he was in motion, his wrist snapping apart as the hidden blade in his sleeve severed the chain binding them. His foot lashed out, striking the nearest soldier in the throat, sending him staggering back. Gunfire erupted. Yaga twisted, grabbing the fallen guard's rifle before anyone could react. 2 shots, precise and final, dropped the men closest to him. He pivoted, using the body of another as a shield, advancing toward the nearest exit. Panic surged through the room. Officials scrambled for cover. Soldiers shouted orders, but it was too late. Baba Yaga was unleashed. He moved like a storm, weaving through gunfire, each movement a calculated strike. He disarmed one guard, using the rifle's stock to shatter his faceplate before turning the weapon on the next. Blood misted the air, bodies crumpling in his wake. Varian did not move. He simply watched. Xyloth stumbled backward, his smirk vanishing. "Kill him," he screeched. The throne room became a battlefield. Yaga slid behind a pillar as bullets ricocheted around him. He ducked, reloaded, and emerged with brutal precision. 3 shots, 3 kills. He advanced through the chaos, his body ignoring the pain, his mind singular in focus. Xyloth was retreating, his guards forming a desperate wall around him. Yaga pushed forward, weaving between columns, closing the distance with terrifying speed. A figure stepped into his path. Varian. For a moment, the battle faded into the background. The 2 men locked eyes. Yaga did not hesitate. He raised his weapon. Varian struck first. The admiral was fast, faster than most men Yaga had faced. He sidestepped the shot, drawing a blade from his belt in a smooth, practiced motion. Yaga barely deflected the strike, the force sending him skidding back. No words were exchanged. There was no need. The fight began. Varian lunged, his movements precise, his strikes relentless. Yaga countered, his instincts razor-sharp despite his wounds. Steel clashed against steel, the sound lost in the storm of battle. Varian's blade grazed Yaga's shoulder. Yaga retaliated with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The admiral staggered, but did not fall. They circled each other, both men breathing hard. And then Yaga saw it, an opening, slight but fatal. He feinted left, forcing Varian to adjust. In that instant, Yaga struck, his knife driving deep into the admiral's side. Varian stiffened, his breath hitching. His grip slackened. Yaga twisted the blade. The admiral exhaled, a ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "It had to be you," he murmured. He fell. There was no time to waste. Yaga stepped over the body, his gaze locking onto Xyloth. The governor was at the far end of the chamber, frantically keying in override codes on a control panel. A hidden passage leading to his escape. Yaga would not allow it. With measured steps, he advanced. Xyloth turned, his face pale. He raised a trembling pistol, his confidence shattered. Yaga did not slow. The governor fired. The shot grazed Yaga's arm, but he did not falter. Xyloth's hand shook as he fired again. Click. Empty. Panic filled his eyes. Yaga reached him, gripping his wrist, twisting until the pistol clattered to the floor. Xyloth gasped, his breath shallow. "Please," he whispered. I can give you anything. Power. Wealth. You don't have to do this." Yaga said nothing. Xyloth's voice broke. "Mercy." The knife flashed. The governor crumpled. The throne room fell silent. The war was over. Yaga stood amidst the wreckage, his breath slow, controlled. Around him, the remnants of the Empire's finest lay dead. And yet he felt nothing. The battle had been won, the vengeance fulfilled. But Eleanor was still gone. He turned, walking past Varian's still form, stepping over broken bodies. His path was clear now, his purpose complete. And yet, as he disappeared into the shadows, whispers followed him. Some said he had died that day, consumed by the fire of his own war. Others believed he still walked among the stars, a specter in the void, waiting for the next name to cross his path. Baba Yaga was no longer just a man. He was a legend.